So I have, sorry, I'm going to, Andrew, Simon, Daniel, Matshepe and Myrtle have the conversation and explain how they work here in Cape Town. Yep, that work for you?
Yep, thank you. Can you hear me?
Well, we're just getting in touch with you now.
But I mean, I've lectured at this for quite a long time. You can, normally you can hear at the back. Students tend to stop at the back. So when we talk about enforcement, typically we're talking about a far wider framework than just police. In terms of cannabis in this country, there have of course been various movements, and there's a lot of ambivalence at the moment in terms of how to enforce something like cannabis, despite because there has been a shift legally, and that ambivalence is cashed out in various forms. Today, I think we want to speak about how that occurs in terms of policing, but I mean, that conversation is a much wider conversation about issues within South African society and the regulatory framework and the concept of governance that we use in the country more broadly. So, I mean, a useful example, an immediate example is the way in which privacy is understood in different parts of, or different segments of society. So the private purposes bill is based on an understanding of privacy which pretty much excludes a large majority of the population. It's one thing to understand privacy in terms of discrete residential units, but those residential units may not be applicable in a block of flats or may not be applicable in a township context. So in terms of policing, is how do you enforce privacy or regulate based on the concept of privacy when that term itself changes quite significantly depending on where you are. Disregarding, of course, the many issues within law enforcement agencies in the country, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, there is a operational complexity to engaging with something which ultimately is still yet to be defined properly in the law. We see this in terms of the issues around how much of a quantity of cannabis one can have before it's considered dealing. At the moment, what's the latest?
5 plants or 750 grams to carry.
Yeah, so I mean, whether you want to quantify it or whether it's even possible to quantify a specific amount that can be held for private purposes vis-a-vis dealing is of course subject to debate. And I think it's something that the police ultimately are battling to deal with because they're not used to this type of ambivalence, and they are ultimately required or tasked on enforcing to the letter a law. And if the law is still being decided, things can fall apart. And I think those things have fallen apart in many instances. So, there's also the broader debate around success. Typically, drug policing in South Africa has occupied the minds of many police for a lot of time, and is a significant portion of the quota of arrests that ultimately are required. In terms of success, when the crime statistics are presented in South Africa, drug policing and the number of arrests are typically seen, so long as they increase, it's seen as a good thing. But in the last, for many years, we've been arresting hundreds of thousands of people on drug charges, and you'd think if you arrested that many people over the time, that there would be less drugs in society, but they're not. So, the bigger question is, do these metrics really measure success, or do they just measure how busy the police have been doing something non-effective? And I think that's the type of conversation we want to engage with today in various ways. And also look towards the rest of Africa. What lessons can we learn there? I think, it's not only South Africa, typically South Africa likes to position itself as one of the few countries in Africa, but there is a lot more going on, and there's a lot more innovation occurring in various regulatory frameworks that everyone can learn lessons from. So in that aspect, I think we can focus on different areas. So that's my little spiel to begin with. On the panel, would anyone like to begin this conversation in any way?
Well, my conversation to do with the police is really, for me it's a personal shift, because it's coming to the time where we have to actually engage with law enforcement in its various forms. So I have to hold back on my personal issues with this, but I'd just like to acknowledge the South African cannabis communities and our long history of the use, cultivation and trade in this plant. I'd like to acknowledge the trauma that we have all been through on a very personal level, because of the policing of cannabis. And you know, back in the day when Jules and I first started this, we were seeing 1,000 arrests a day. And that's not an exaggeration. And at Fields of Green for All, we would maybe see less than 10% of those arrests being reported to our arrest helpline. But luckily we got the advice very early on, in around 2014, start saving this data. Because at least you, when drug arrests are recorded, they're all recorded together. So after 2018, we saw this huge statistical drop in drug arrests, and that was because the arrests for cannabis were less. But even till today, and Charles, who mans our 24-hour helpline, will tell you that even to today, we get like maybe 5 or 6 calls a week. So it is still carrying on today. And if we have to acknowledge this trauma, I think that we have to in order to heal it, we need to, again, consult the experts. So I'm very pleased that over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working with the University of Bristol and the University of Cape Town on the Cannabis Africana project, which had to do with drugs and development in Africa. But when that project came to an end, we kind of said to all the academics, and now? And then we managed to get some implementation funding for an actual police reform project, which has been a long time coming. So the first part of the project is the community engagement, and we got some amazing submissions, 25 of them, all from communities. So those 25 submissions probably included a few thousand of our cannabis communities. And we were able to look at those submissions and see the main areas of concern, and then we're going to take those submissions and integrate them into our larger project, which is engaging with the South African police and the other law enforcement agencies. But as you know, at the moment we've got the Madlanka Commission going on, and we've got all sorts of nonsense going on the sidelines. So we're just hoping and forging a way forward. We had thought we were going to go straight to SAP head office in Pretoria, but I think it's quite an art to find the right people at whatever level of law enforcement in order to engage with them and in order to take the message forward about what we have learned over the last 16 years. And then the second part of the community engagement is actually looking and getting the message out there for our communities that it's all very well to know your rights, which we've been preaching and preaching over the years, but it is also going back to what Steve said, to know your responsibilities, and those 3 golden pillars of, as a cannabis community, we also have responsibilities. We can't, this is not just a free-for-all. So this is a multi-layered project that will be carrying on for at least the next 2 years, and hopefully we can incrementally make some progress on this. It is the apex issue in cannabis and law enforcement.
Yeah, I think it's also important to, you know, when people say policing needs to change, is, well, what do you want policing to look like in the future? You know, it's one thing to say stop the cops.
Yeah.
It's another to engage with law enforcement in an operational environment so as that they can begin thinking through for themselves how to do things differently. You know, cannabis has for many years been a occupational interest of the police, and you know, I mean, it's informed a lot of the arrests that they've undertaken. So redirecting them to do something else requires a structured process and a structured plan. You know, simply saying stop isn't going to work, because at the lowest level, at least, at a station level, the police are mandated to undertake arrests so as that, you know, essentially performance metrics can be met, KPIs can be met. So simply saying stop isn't going to work. Rather, for instance, in our case, what we've been trying to do is reshape those performance metrics so as that they can begin thinking about other ways of understanding what success is. You know, and I think that's a much broader conversation in South Africa, is what do we consider to be successful policing? Typically, it's one of busyness rather than, you know, performance and the creation of safe environments. Andrew?
Thanks. Sorry to interrupt. Not interrupt. So I just want to offer a slight correction. So I fully agree with what you're saying, especially on if you want police to do something different, you need to provide them a different pathway. I just want to clarify that in the South African context, arrests have never been an official performance target. So I would say they're a culturally generated metric of success in South African policing, but there is no target that by this month one needs to have arrested X number of people. Just to give you some context, I was joking with Myrtle that she must keep her anti-police antagonism back because I come from the police side. But I've walked a fine line. So I was a police reservist for a long time, in part because I was very interested in this idea of what can police offer in a democracy in terms of my primary interest is reducing violence and creating public safety. And it was very clear to me from the start, and then my academic work has been ethnographic, following them around. It was very clear from the start, it is just a grey world. It is very difficult for that operational cop to see where's the moral good versus bad. And that's where I think Simon's point about offering a structured alternative will make it easier, because the culture generates an internal logic of arrest is a success, even though it's not an official KPI. If you can give, and so when I go out, my shift commander might say, if you don't arrest somebody, you will have failed. And I've heard shift commanders say that at parade briefings before going out. However, it isn't an official thing. So it's about how do we change that internal logic, and just to recognize what you were saying, and I'm repeating myself, but not official. But a couple of years ago, and I told this to you the other day, I was briefing the National Commissioner and the Board of Commissioners on how they do millions of activities every year. If you look at the South African Police Service's annual report, they'll say we searched 30,000 people, we seized X number of drugs. And it's as if they're saying, look, we're very busy, we're very successful. But then if you track the murder rate, it just continues going up. And I always come back to murder because that's our most reliable proxy for overall violent crime. There's always going to be a body, so the state will become aware of that, whereas 50% of assaults won't be reported, 70% of burglaries won't be reported. And the National Commissioner's response was, how can you tell me we're not effective when our prisons are overflowing? So that goes back to, there's a cultural narrative of, well, if we are putting bodies in prisons, we are succeeding. And I do think that for a long time, the easiest way to do that was through cannabis-related enforcement. And now we are in this grey zone. And I do want to support your point that if this group can provide a clear alternative, the South African Police Service and other enforcement bodies can internalize that into the culture and take it forward in a way that benefits everybody.
There's an irony, having worked with quite a few police by time, that a lot of police officers recognize the futility in undertaking cannabis or drug-related arrests, because conviction rates are significantly low in terms of actually processing people. So all you have is this essentially revolving door framework in which people are arrested, put into holding, released, and it goes on and on and on, because on one hand, that is considered a good thing in terms of policing, that you caught someone doing something that is not right, in inverted commas. But then, the big question is, well, how do we process it? How do we do something with it? Because, as soon as you start going through the courts, then there's going to be requirements of evidence and issues around that. So I think, in terms of success and in terms of policing more generally, internally, one of the big questions they're asking is, well, what do we do now? And, it's a question that we're trying to answer for them, but ultimately requires a shift in cultural logic, moving away from this idea that policing is about being busy to policing is about creating safer communities. Again, that speaks to something about, we see this in the gangs a lot as well, is that, that may be policing gangs and we may be sending the military into these communities, but are these communities any safer? No, not at all. In fact, we've thought we would have learned these lessons in the past, but unfortunately, we seem to be doing the same thing over and expecting a different result. Has there been any innovation in Africa more generally? That might be more.
So not innovation per se, but issues with policing in Ghana for cannabis, which has resulted in a situation where now it has become sort of like cannabis use is effectively reserved for a certain economic class of individuals. And so if you just follow me, it's a bit of a storyline, so if we can just go through. So in 1990, we had a law that was passed which effectively criminalized cannabis, so that the punishment for possession of, I always like to use the example of a single roll of weed, was 10 years minimum. Wow. Yeah. So we lawyers had to come up with ways and means where if you are caught with one roll of weed, the police will tell you that, look, point is, you are caught with possession, this is the law, you're going to jail for 10 years. What then happened was we came up with a mechanism, for want of a better way of putting it, where the rule is possession, right? But the mens rea or the intent behind it should have been that you knew that what you had was weed or cannabis. And so what we used to do was you go to court and go and say that yes, he had it, but he did not know it was cannabis. And so because of that, he did not have the mens rea, and for that reason he's not guilty. And also, if you read a long line of cases, that's exactly what we were pleading. That he didn't know that what he had was what is prohibited. As far as he was concerned, he uses it for medicinal purposes or for religious purposes. All right, and so this is what happened. The idea behind it was to try and reduce the use of cannabis, because the understanding at the time was that it is bad for your health and we ought to stop using it. What then happened, or ended up happening, was the richer individuals, if you are caught with it, all you need to do is just pay the police off. Because then it became a case of, if you are seen with it, would you want to just pay me, or you go to jail for 10 years? Because they would process you very quickly. It's a strict liability offense. Unless you are able to afford a lawyer, again, economic class, you are most likely to go to prison. So we had a lot of people that were in jail for 10 years for being caught with one roll of weed or something that was wrapped in their pockets that looked like weed. Fast forward to the early 2010s, there was a huge proliferation of cannabis. And so there was this thing that we used to say where in Ghana, if you are going out at night, and it's not official, but we know it, if you are going out at night and you want to use cannabis, just make sure you also have money. Because when the police people see you and they stop you, once they see it, all you need to do is just pay and go. But then again, it resulted in a situation where if you were below a certain economic class, you will almost always end up in prison. Because the people that we buy it from are below a certain economic class, and the police always go after them. But then you, the person involved, you, the one that is actually using the cannabis, as long as you can afford to pay the police people, you are fine. So whenever a friend or a colleague calls you and it's like, look, I've been arrested, you're like, just pay. Ask them how much they want and pay off and go away. All right? Now the police people now also realize that, this is a good way to make money. And so they know the hotspots, the clubs that people usually like to use weed. And so when you are going there, right before you turn in, there's always a police barrier there. Like, we know them by name. So when they see you, they're like, can I check? You're like, no, it's fine, just take this and go. If you don't know it, a lot of foreigners who didn't know it, who were coming around for vacations or whatnot, as far as they are concerned, Ghanaian weed is good weed. And so it means that it's legal. But the police people see you and stop you, and then they end up extorting. Now, government now realizes that Ghanaian weed or cannabis from Ghana is making a lot of money outside the country, but we are not seeing any of it within the country. So that I always make the joke, I was telling them there that my first knowledge of the fact that apparently weed that is produced in Ghana is premium weed, I found out in the Netherlands. I had no idea. So someone in the Netherlands was telling me this, and I was like, how? Because it's supposed to be illegal back home, but there's a huge market for it, and they keep getting their supply. So with this wave of decriminalization and government wanting a bite of the cake, they then now pass a law in 2020, which now effectively reduces the penalty. So in the preamble, they say that this is for the purpose of weed is no longer, cannabis are no longer treated as a crime, but a health concern. And the punishment has now been reduced from 10 years. But then now here's where I have a problem, which is why I was like, it's a bit of a story if you followed me so far. If you are saying it's a health concern and it's no longer a crime, then there should not be punishment for possession. But what they've done is that they have introduced a new punishment for possession, which they say is now just a fine. A fine of between 2,400 cedis, which is the equivalent of about 3,000 rand to about 10,000 rand. And if you are unable to pay the fine, then you have a term of imprisonment of 15 months. So then at the end of the day, it comes back to the same thing, where it's now an issue of, do you have money to pay? If you have money to pay, then you can use it. If you do not have money to pay, then you cannot use it. So now the bargaining point from the enforcement position is now, okay, if we process you before court, the minimum that you are going to pay is about 3,000 rand. So if you can give me 1,500 or 2,000 rand, I'll let you go. If you decide not to, then what that does is now you have a criminal record, although you are able to pay for something that the government is saying that is a health concern and it's not a crime. And so we've come back to the position where the use of cannabis is effectively available only to individuals who have the means of paying, because that's the way the fine systems work. And then those that do not have the means of paying, you just have to hope that you never get caught. And that's the problem that we are currently struggling with. Now, the data that is available on this is very, very limited because there are very few reported cases on cannabis and cannabis use. So we try to look at the ones that are available recently. It's work that is currently ongoing. I'm trying to see if we can find funding for it and see who is actually being criminalized for these things. And of the cases that we've reviewed so far between 2020 and now, every single person is, if you look at the professions of the individuals, is always below a certain economic class. So the person works in a bar, the person is unemployed. Not once have any of the cases dealt with a lawyer or a politician or nothing of the sort. Meanwhile, amongst us, we know we are the biggest users. And so it goes back to the point that it is effectively criminalizing not its use per se, but its use amongst a certain economic class of individuals. And we are hoping that once we are able to get this data out and start pushing for it, then the criminalization itself will go away completely. And then we can now start having proper conversations about how we are allowed to use it, who is allowed to use it, for what purposes, what quantities you're allowed to keep it, and things like that. But until then, what we've done now is just gone around to pass a law that looks less punitive. But at the end of the day, it's still criminalizing cannabis use amongst a certain class or a category of individuals. And so that's where we are at now. Yes, it is legalized in certain quantities for the purposes of production of pharmaceuticals and things like that. And you need licenses to be able to do that. And again, the licenses are expensive. And so you would also need capital to be able to cultivate. And for individuals who decide to cultivate in their backyards, there's a whole other punishment regime for that, for something which is supposed to be a health concern. And so effectively, it's now a case of, if you are poor, you can't use. If you have the means, then you can use. And just hope you never get caught. So that's where we are at currently. There's work that is currently we are still trying to do to push so that we move beyond this. But this is where we are at in Ghana in relation to the use of cannabis and its criminalization.
Yeah, I think there's a long history of drug regulation and drug control being a proxy for ultimately the regulation of poverty. It's a means of policing poverty, and that you've come up that there's that example. It's not so strange if you look at the history books. With regards to cocaine in the US, there was a certain senator who decided that crack cocaine was 100 times more dangerous based on nothing but his own opinion, and that was implemented so as that the sentencing structure was 100 times more severe for crack cocaine. Now, because of the economic differences between cocaine and crack cocaine, the result of which is that a large percentage of the Black American population was criminalized and put in jail, and that lingering concern is still visible in the demographics of prison populations in the US, simply because of a thumbsuck in terms of who decided what about crack cocaine. And Matshepe, you may have something to say about victims and the framing of individuals in terms of cannabis regulation and policing.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Simon. So I've always had an issue from where it begins originally with police discretion, private use, and what officers actually do when they find individuals with or in possession of cannabis. So in terms of possession, it can exist, or private use rather, it can exist outside of one's home. So for instance, it can be found in your pocket, it can be found, or you indulging in your own private home and whatnot. But I've always had an issue with how the arrests are made and the wide discretion that the police have when having to arrest individuals. Not mainly because of the fact that the amount that you are supposed to be found in possession of and the quantity has not necessarily been described, or there isn't a set quantity, but how the police come about to finding out whether or not is it for private use or dealing and selling, and how it can quickly move from private use and possession to it being a criminal offense in terms of selling and dealing. Police officers do know that they're supposed to be ask certain questions and be satisfied that, okay, this is for private use. But then what happens if you deem it private use and they deem it selling and dealing, and you get arrested? The effects of it, you can be overturned later or it can be corrected later, but the effects that one bears of being arrested from that point to you being detained, what happens at detention centers, is it really, really necessary for us to go through that simply because we are found in possession of that? And it's quite difficult for one to ascertain whether or not they are indulging perfectly or legally when they are always scared of being caught. Yet there's a law that really says that, hey, you can actually, as an adult, privately use it. I was having a conversation earlier with the lady there where she explained that in an engagement on a roadblock with one of the police officers, they're like, hey, I have a role. And she was like, okay, it's okay. And the police was like, you don't have rights here. I can give you a fine. And she was automatically given a fine or arrest you on the spot. So that is the kind of effect that I have a problem with the wide discretion given to police to make arrests. And when you look up the arrests that are made for cannabis, it's usually 13,000 to 17,000 people arrested for that. What happens after is important, but do we really, really, really have to go through that and the trauma and the psychological effect it has for maybe being in possession and for private use when the laws dictate otherwise? So that's why I am.
It's a good point. Is that do we have to invoke the armature of the entire criminal justice system in dealing with possession cases? And I think, within the criminal justice system, a lot of people are aware that this is a waste of time and money, and the results of which is that all of our prisons or remand centers are full. To what effect? So the big question is, alternative in terms of law enforcement environment though, is what do you do or how do you replace that? What do you do in terms of finding another solution? And if it's the issuing of fines or if it's the issuing of summons or the like, those are things that still need to, I think, be explored more fully in the South African context. Is what do we do in terms of to replace arrest? And as you mentioned, because of discretion, because of the framework in which success is understood numerically, we tend to end up in a position where arrests are ultimately seen as a good thing, when in fact we all know they're a waste of time, effort, and a lot of money.
Simon, I'm sure I'm going to speak on behalf of a lot of the activists present that there's going to be a sense of frustration that this is a conversation that's been going on for a long time. It's not that the police have this wide discretion anymore. There are two national directives which talk, the first one to cannabis and the second one to arresting generally. The first one defines what is the interpretation that's supposed to be placed by the South African Police Service when it comes to whether or not this is private cannabis and this is an arrestable offence. The second one relates to preferring other means of achieving attendance at court to arrest. You have to handle these things on a case-by-case basis. These directives have been out since 2023, and yet we're still having this conversation to the point that certain activists in the room are now having to consider applying to interdict the police or put a mandamus into place to actually have these directives implemented effectively. The question really, does anybody on the panel have any insight into this? Because these directives conclude with quite a key paragraph which says that failure to adhere to this directive could result in a disciplinary action. Now, we can talk till the cows come home about changing the culture of SAPS, but if SAPS individual SAPS members are actually not adhering to national directives, the question is there any enforcement of these possible disciplinary steps? Are rogue SAPS members who are not adhering to these directives actually being held to account? Is there any sort of data on whether anybody has been disciplined for non-adherence to these things?
I volunteered for the SAPS, I didn't work for them. But I did, sorry?
It's all up to you. It's all on your head.
There was a question asked in Parliament a couple of years ago about, because 53 billion rand in civil claims have been lodged against the SAPS for illegal arrests, many of which would have been substance related. And the response by the minister was there's not a single person has been disciplined. So that's the short answer. I think it doesn't help you, but I think it goes back to culture. Police officials are not adhering to a huge array of directives. And I'm not sure how one challenges that, I'm not sure how one challenges that. And it sounds like you and all members of the community have been direct victims of this. I would like to think, and I may be naive, there has been this plummeting of drug-related arrests since 2023 when the Directorate came out. It has started going up in recent years. I would like to think that that's more tip-related, because within the city of Cape Town, which I work for, there is still a big incentive internally to do stops and searches. The claim is we're looking for drugs, quote unquote, but I would think that's a tip, and firearms. I mean, when you were talking about Ghana, I was thinking, why would the state place a burden on itself to pay to house somebody for 10 years for having a little thing? In the South African context, we arrest all of these people, but they all get kicked out on Monday morning. So the criminal justice system is spitting them out, which is why it's a waste. But yeah, if people are literally still being harassed, and I'm sure there are some stories, then I think one just needs to bring attention to that and embarrass the SAPS and the pressure on them. I would think there would be a break point, but maybe I'm naive.
And sorry if I can just supplement, I mean, this is anecdotal, I don't actually have any stats on this, but it seems like much as our colleague was talking about, there has become this almost two-tier policing where either you can't afford to bribe the police or you're unwilling to bribe the police, and therefore you are treated differently to those who can afford or are willing to bribe the police. And there's just this incentive that needs to go away, and I'm not sure that it's going to be achieved by talking in these soft terms of cultural change. Until there's enforcement from within the SAPS, maybe I'm a cynic, but I don't see that there's going to be a material change.
Yeah, I'll hand it over, but just when I say cultural change, it is that leadership needs to change to drive the culture. So I'm saying the same thing, but the question is, how do we get the leadership to drive that?
Yeah, and I was just going to further problematize it in line with what you're saying. And it's work that Matshepe is currently doing, but she's looking at it in relation to wrongful convictions and what happens to the police officers who are in charge of these arrests that result in wrongful convictions. And her findings so far are nothing.
Yes.
Absolutely nothing happens to them. And so at the end of the day, they know that, well, come what may, this is none of my business. Nothing is going to happen to me anyway. If anything happens to me at all, the system itself swallows it up. The proceedings end up going nowhere. And then the same thing keeps happening. And so if even in a situation where this is where someone has gone through the entire criminal justice system and we've come to the conclusion that the arrest was wrong, the investigations was not properly done, this should not have even gone on in the first place. And the police people who were in charge of it, nothing is happening to them. I'm wondering how we can talk about enforcement of directives which are even less difficult or more difficult to track to see who is doing what. And so it's a big issue that, like as Andrew is saying, we need to figure out how we are going to deal with it. Otherwise, at the end of the day, like you rightly said, we'll just talk, and the police will do whatever they want. Yeah.
I think though that 53 billion is a significant concern within SAPS in terms of litigation. You know, I mean, it's a lot of money, especially when you want to spend money on VIP escorts and the like. So in that instance, you know, there is, at least from what I'm aware of, a conversation around, not so much about drug policing, but how do we reduce litigation?
Yeah.
And that's a conversation that I think is fraught with difficulty as well.
Well, and just to add, before Simon called you out, so the 53 billion is half of the SAP's annual budget,
Yeah.
but only 300 million gets paid out,
Yeah.
and the National Treasury has a cost recovery policy where that cost needs to be recovered from the official responsible, but that's never been implemented. So it goes back to leadership. We've got stuff on paper, it doesn't get implemented. Simon, would you like to call out the
So yeah, behind you.
I'm open to correction, but I do recall that around 2019 there was also a national police
Yes.
directive that said that any civil lawsuits, the arresting officers had to pay themselves. What's
Yeah.
happening with that?
No, well,
Why are the taxpayers still paying
Yeah.
for the police's mess ups?
That's what I was saying. There is
Yeah.
from the Treasury side as well, there is an official directive, but it hasn't ever been implemented. And so it goes back to our leadership crisis.
It needs implementation.
Someone needs
that
to
will stop
implement
it.
what is on paper.
But I mean, it's also, yeah, I mean, it's not that easy to implement. I mean, just taking devil's advocate here, is that you are asking, so say that someone does mess up unintentionally, how do you then you're essentially taking that.
But it's gone through the court, and the court has said they were responsible.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, it's also, I mean, where do we place the emphasis on success here? Is it around arrest, or do we hold police officers accountable for a longer, part of the criminal justice system in which they have to provide the correct evidence, the right evidence, and good evidence in a court of law? Because at the moment, that's a more grey area.
I think.
Myrtle, you want to
Yeah.
chime
No,
in?
I just think that we have a big institutional gap here, because if you look at the various government departments, apart from the fact that they all work in silos and it's all just a little bit dysfunctional, when you think of the use, cultivation, and trade in cannabis. So the cultivators, the farmers, and all, they have the Department of Agriculture. The trade, which is perpetually imminent, to quote Tony Budden, who's a pity is now chair, he always used to say, oh, the perpetual imminence of cannabis, The trade have the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition looking after them. But when it comes to the use of cannabis and your ordinary common and garden stoner, who do we have in terms of a government department looking after our interests and our rights? We have nobody. There's nobody who stands between us and law enforcement, us and the Department of Justice, who are perpetually absent in the current regulatory regime. So I think we have this big gap there, and what we've always proposed is that we need the Office of the Cannabis Ombudsman, with Bud in capital letters, because that is where the institutional gap is. And maybe if one was able to, in a dream world, establish an office like that, there would be somebody who could police these directives that were so hard won by a lot of us in this room in the Pakistan in 2023. So that is where the gap is. And when it comes to our rights, the huge lofty ideals of human rights, and then the, I wouldn't say lesser ideals, but also important ideals of cultural and indigenous rights, which are enshrined in international law. Why do we not have anything that looks after the rights of your common and garden user in South Africa? Because there's nothing that stands between us and the police. And I know it's asking for a bit much, but if you think of just ordinary citizens in South Africa, I think that could be a possible solution.
That being said, just to throw a little spanner there, is that at the moment the gap between institution and person does change depending on how much income you have. Because if you have access to good lawyers, then you can help the process a little. So, yeah.
Yeah. Prevention is always better than cure. And the hardcore truth is that the issue of substance abuse is not a police issue. So saddling the police, which still has this culture of force as opposed to service inculcated in them, is really not assisting with the whole issue. And the conventional wisdom is that substance use and abuse should be regulated by social development as such. And people tend to think that when you speak of dagga, the word that Myrtle like to use, which also I think it's appropriate, is that drugs and crime, people think that Dagga is just axiomatically fitting into those categories, which is not the truth. It is a cultural and it is a customary practice which has now also become a highly lucrative industry, but lucrative in the sense of being able to provide within the abilities of people. And the fact that we are wasting valuable police resources on fighting a losing battle, that is really, it's one of the paradoxes that we have within South Africa. And the sooner we get the regulation of cannabis away from the police, the better it will be for all people. Because what's happening in Ghana and in other places, we all look to South Africa, it's just arbitrary. The fact that if you've got money, then you're not going to suffer the effects of unlawful arrest, that's just wicked at the end of the day. And we shouldn't have that. And within South Africa, the largest number of arrests are still cannabis related. It's not TIC. Although it is in the Western Cape, that is a huge problem. The majority of arrests, as the experts tells you, is not for other drugs. It's cannabis related, and it's wicked.
And our Department of Social Development is particularly dysfunctional as we speak. And the Central Drug Authority doesn't even have a mandate. They're not actually even constituted as a body at the moment. They're sitting somewhere in limbo. So we can't even look to social development at the moment.
The paradox of that is I completely agree with you that drugs should not be an enforcement issue, but there is, in terms of the SAP, there is a lot of public pressure for the police to intervene in drug-related issues. Think about when drugs are found in a community, the community themselves phone the police and they come do something. So it's not just a change in shifted emphasis in terms of in police, it's within society as a whole. We need to stop calling the police for all of our problems and start dealing with them either by ourselves or with other government departments, but again, presupposing they actually work or even exist.
Office of the Cannabis Ombudsman.
Yeah, I'm not encouraging vigilante justice. Daniel, you had something?
There's another one there.
Yeah, before we move away too far from the point, just to add to what you said, Simon, about problematizing who and how and when gets held accountable for wrongful arrests. Right? I think the structural issue there with regards to policing culture again and leadership, well, the vacuum of it, is definitely evidenced in speaking to police. I've spoken to many police officers. I make it a hobby of mine, to ask them, do they know about the directives? Do they understand them? And most of them have not heard of them. So now again, you want to hold this person accountable, but they've never even heard of this directive, even though it's addressed to the entire SAPS. So just to that point in how the information doesn't get to where it needs to go, and we might be holding people accountable for things they're not aware of.
Yeah.
Sorry, so not so much a question, just speaking from experience, I have a number of cannabis lounges. One of them's in
Based in Cape Town?
One of them's in Sea Point, one of them's in town. We've been visited by the police multiple times. They've never ever once come to enforce anything. They've come to purchase. In fact, the other day we had somebody coming in their police uniform. I was very upset with my doorman for letting him in, but they let the guy in and he purchased in the uniform. What we've seen in Sea Point is what we would expect around the country, which is common sense policing. I think Sea Point Main Road has 15 or 16 different stores in what is 2 kilometers of road. Okay, they're blatantly out on the road. Some of them even have glass windows. You can see people transacting in the stores from the street. The captain from the Sea Point Police Department has been to a number of the stores. He's quite friendly with some of the owners. He knows what's going on. He's very happy with what's happening in Sea Point. From anecdotally, I understand that the number of drug arrests in Sea Point have gone down since these shops have opened. The cops are very accommodating. They're very happy. The problem with this is that it's based on your socio-economic situation. Okay? We know that it's not the same thing that's happening all over the place. The only time we've had a problem in town when the cops wanted to come in was actually when they were looking for liquor licenses, and we took over a restaurant that had a liquor license. I said to them, sorry, we don't sell alcohol. They said, thanks, goodbye. So our experience is actually what it should be, and we're very happy with it. It's possible that they can do it. They've shown that they can do it. this needs to be pushed out to other police officers, to other police stations around the country. I know for a fact that partners up in Johannesburg or other places pay the police thousands of rands on a weekly basis to keep their stores open. Okay? Starts off with one guy, next week he says my captain needs, my partner needs, my this, my that, and once it's a very slippery slope once you start. So we know that the police are messing around. Our drive should really be to take the good examples and try and show people around the country, the police, the people in charge, that it does work and it can work everywhere. And just because it's Sea Point doesn't mean that it's special. The cops are doing the right thing there, probably out of the wrong intentions because they're dealing with very upper class, kind of rich white people. But this can be spread across the country. It really doesn't need to be focused in one area.
And you have the all-seeing eye of tourism, regulating those interactions so it's, things are, I mean, that's why when you have student protests, typically they're not dealt with the same way people are dealt with in townships because the press are here and the media is here watching the things happen.
Quick response. I think that's great, and if anyone were able to write that up as a little case study, that would be good. Of course, I doubt the SAPs would actually want it to be said that, oh, look at these good cops supporting the trade. But this links to something which I think touches on many of the things that have been said, which is, I think there's a legacy of the link between cannabis, organized crime, violence, and it's that spectrum that is the problem, and we have to de-link that. And it goes to this conversation, Gunnar, we were chatting about it earlier, about this willingness to regulate, self-regulate, formally regulate. Can we get that further? If we can take the idea of cannabis away from the idea of our history of extreme violence and crime, then that will be a big victory, and the SAPs, going back to culture, will be able to say, we're not going to focus on that, it's a waste of our time. Police want to reduce harm, ideally. So what's happening in Sea Point is they're saying it's a waste of our time to focus on this, we can reduce harm by doing other things. And I think those are the kind of points we want to aim for. And just the last point is, I talked earlier about the drop in drug enforcement. There is a clear link between if you track drug-related crime in the SAPs, it goes up from the late 20s, along with murder. And there is no relationship between, we arrest more and more people, murder continues to go up. So we've shown that the war on drugs doesn't reduce violence. There is this move towards decriminalization, legalization. We need to decouple the harm and policing. And I think that was a good point. It's about taking that Sea Point example and moving it up.
And therefore freeing up a lot of resources for other things. It's more important than policing people smoking weed.
I would like to counter on good policing, because we're seeing a different trend in Cape Town as well, where in the northern suburbs it's become a bit of a trend where the tactical unit will be used by gangs to go and raid clubs and steal the stock, and there's no recourse because there's nothing put on record. So, it is very much relevant to the affluence of the area where the police are operating, as well as the connections into the mobs that they do have. And I think South Africa, because our police has been captured specifically in the Western Cape, we need to also acknowledge that, policing is not always about peacekeeping, but it's about keeping things moving in the way for those with the greatest interests. And this goes a lot further and a lot deeper. So, we've dealt with situations like this in this past year with the work that we do, where we've had to kind of grab in, where, the correct police are not showing up, but with the support of the tactical unit, they're acting completely beyond their mandate. So, how do we change that part of the policing culture when it is so ingrained with the criminal underworld as well?
I think there is a recognition of the use of policing resources strategically by criminal elements to further their own aims is being recognized. It's a question of how do you stop it?
Yeah.
It's not so easy.
Just out of interest, is that the SAPs? Is it the TRT, or do you know which?
Yes.
The TRT, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, so we had a situation earlier this year where they went out to a social club. They had tried on other counts as well. They tried with the liquor license, they tried with the extraction and that kind of thing. They went in on community complaints, and then suddenly they just rocked up. They raided this club. It did some circulation on socials as well. There were people being beaten by the police, pepper sprayed without provocation, and there was no recourse to be followed on that case as far as we know. And because they acted outside of their mandate with no police support, there was no official record keeping of that. And that's not an isolated incident, it's just one that we're aware of through having consulted with the people involved.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can't comment, but there will always be a record, there will be a tracker in the vehicle, those cops have to account for their time.
All of it's gone. It's all gone.
There must be CCTV. Anyway,
Yeah.
I realize there are abuses happening all over the country. I'd like to think there are ways to solve this, but
I mean, the question of using TRT against the cannabis club to me seems a bit of like an unfair use of resources and not the optimization of TRT's time and effort, but
So a quick question, you know, when it comes to policing and cannabis, where's common sense fitting to?
That's a very good question. If we had common sense, I don't think we would be having this conversation.
I think you can't, at the moment, common sense is not legislated into any law.
Although this being said, to support SAPS, common sense is not that easy to have when you are at an operational level dealing with a lot of violence coming your way. So it's one thing, in terms of C-pointed policing, but in a context where you as the police are not favoured by the community and the community may be actively against you, simply making common sense decisions is not always that easy. What we think of common, you just rely on training.
Common sense infers a discretion. Like you're applying your discretion to find out, is this a reasonable circumstance for you to engage in this trade? And whenever there's discretion, there's going to be abuse.
Yeah.
And until now, at least in my opinion, the emergence of the private clubs has come off the spurs of using privacy to share cannabis. And this is beyond the ambit of what the Prince Judgment found. The Prince Judgment found that you can access cannabis within your innermost sanctum. The moment you're introducing a social or commercial element to that, you step outside of the innermost sanctum. So this is beyond the ambit of what was intended in the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act. We're seeing now with the regulations that are put forward, 750 grams is a limit for both personal possession and private possession. Sweeping that with the same brushstroke is not going to achieve anything. This sort of ambivalence between privacy and public possession is going to create even more difficulty in the enforcement, but it doesn't solve the issue of being able to allow for a commercial space for this to operate in. And this is where we need to have DTIC come forward and announce some sort of business framework that the clubs can operate within. But to rest on the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act, to run your club system, and this is where my question comes into the police. Under what sort of on what basis are you allowing this trade to happen? In my opinion, it's the police are then breaking the law just as much as we are, and I'm not saying that's a problem. I really love the fact that we have 11,000 clubs that are already emerged, and we are seeing this trade come forward, and a lot of tax base can come from this. So it's great to see businesses and businessmen and women putting their neck on the line to fight for this justice, and rightfully so. We're not going to wait. It's been 5 years since the Prince Judgment, and we still don't have the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act. The regulations still haven't been passed. I sent the department an email last week. What's happening? We commented in March. What's happening? It's sitting on the desk of the minister. I'm like, okay, but how long? How long is it going to take? And surely by now there's been updates. Can you just let us know what updates are? It's nothing. So I like the fact that we as an industry are taking the lead and then doing our self-governance and maintaining pillars of making sure the cannabis is fit for consumption, make sure you've got some sort of control point of access, and then making sure that your customers are over a certain age to get access. This is fine. And in terms of harm reduction, this is great. What you want to see the police do is continue chasing after your sort of black market illicit drug trafficking, stepping into human trafficking and hardcore drugs. This still needs to be policed. But honest use of cannabis in private clubs, and this is what we're seeing in Germany. The model that came forward, they said the police must not be wasting their resources on honest cannabis use. And this is what I want to see our sort of paradigm sort of step into, is recognizing that private cannabis clubs is a very safe space to distribute cannabis responsibly, and the alternative being the black market. Police still need to go after your hardcore criminals, but for the most part of it, that does not exist within our private cannabis club system. But what is the basis for this? There is no basis. There needs to be a law that is passed. We've got the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act, we need a Cannabis for Commercial Purposes Act, or something to this nature that literally just has a new legislative framework. I know the business license, the Department of Small Business Development has tabled a business licensing bill, which is set to encapsulate this private cannabis club gap. But the scheduling of THC at Schedule 6 does not allow, and basically in this bill it says they're not going to step on anyone else's toes. Medicine Act regulates Schedule 6 substance, so you can't trade in a Schedule 6 substance unless you have a pharmacy set up and doctors prescribing, which, by the way, is also a great mechanism for responsible distribution. But that leaves out your layman that wants to be able to sell his own blood between his friends. So this is a massive gap, and the moment you don't have clarity, there's going to be abuse. And we're just sitting here, frogs sitting boiling in a boiling pot, just waiting to die. You know. But
sorry, if I can just say something. The whole Schedule 6 thing is ridiculous, because what other Schedule 6 medication can you make at home? Maybe one.
I mean, you can make opioids.
You can't. It's illegal. It's illegal.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for this panel, but you can continue this conversation. I'd just like to thank you all for attending, and you know, I think a lot gets lost on ministers' desks, and the ministers have very big desks.
And you know, we can continue this conversation now in half an hour when I'll be with my colleague John over there, because it's a very South African conversation. So in half an hour we'll be talking about the South African situation.
Let's get a round of applause for the panelists.